So when you are at IEP or ARD meetings, are there like so many acronyms being thrown around? It's like, what in the world are they talking about? It kind of feels like alphabet soup, right? Well, today the acronym we're going to be talking about is P W N. PWN. Have you heard that before? Well, you might have heard about it, and you might know it stands for prior written notice. But I think that P is like confusing to us. It's like prior. What do you mean prior to what? So that's one of the questions that we're going to be answering today. And we're also going to be talking specifically about what needs to be in a prior written notice, when you need to receive that, and why it's important. So welcome to our live viewers. And if you're watching on the replay, welcome. Make sure you type in hi, where you're watching from, and let us know any comments or questions you have. So before we dive into the content, let me introduce myself. I'm Charmaine Tanner. I'm a retired teacher, a parent, and author of a #1 best-selling book, The Art of Advocacy. And I host this show each week because I'm passionate about helping parents become even more effective advocates. I work a lot with families as an advocate, but this weekly show is a way that I can reach a lot of parents and share information with you. So welcome. I'm glad you're here. We're going to start our show. So let me bring up our pictures here. So you might have seen this on my Facebook page where it's like, do you often hear no when you request things, but you're like wondering why they said no? Or maybe you request things for your child and you never get any kind of response. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So LaDonna, say, hey, I'm glad she made it. She's from Idaho. Marlo's here. And yeah, Marlo, you can always catch the replay. Yes. And Nancy Brown noticed that my time for my video today was 12:01, not 12, not 12:15, but 12:01. So I'm super excited that you're here. And like I said, make sure that you type in questions because that's when our show becomes even more helpful when we can ask or answer your specific questions. So here is our alphabet soup, that PWN. And now we know that it stands for prior written notice. But exactly when are you supposed to get this prior written notice? Well, there are specific things in the federal law, and you always want to also check with your state rules and regs, because sometimes your state gives you even more rights than the federal law does. But because we have people from a variety of states, we're going to look at what the federal IDEA says. So you are supposed to get a prior written notice, which is a written document, when the school district proposes to either initiate or change the identification of your child. So if they're looking at changing the disability label where you're under which your child qualifies for special ed services, that would trigger for them to write you a prior written notice. If they're going to initiate a new evaluation, such as an FBA or an annual review, and they feel like they need to update some testing, or every 3 years when they're going to request some new testing, that triggers, you should be getting a prior written notice. If your child's placement is going to change, you want to make sure that you get that prior written notice. In just a moment, we're going to talk about prior written notice, or as far as if your child's placement is changed. So there is a difference between placement and location. And placement, you get input on, and the IEP team decides that. Location is where the actual classroom is going to be, like in which school building. That is a district decision. So if they change the location of where your child is going to receive services and be, integrated into general ed, you don't get a prior written notice about that. But if they change their placement from a more restrictive or less restrictive placement, that triggers a prior written notice. So Lissa is here. Hey, Lissa. So I'm so glad we've got lots of people with us, and Illinois is being represented. So that's fun. Like I said, as we go along, stop me, ask questions, because then you walk away with getting those questions answered instead of still kind of wondering about things, right? So let's carry on, because there are some other times that you need to also get the prior written notice. The other thing that you want to look at is any change, or if they're looking at changing your child's provision of a free appropriate public education, you would also need to get a prior written notice at that time. So let's look, because there's a few more here. There are times when the district refuses to initiate or change. So if you ask the district for a new evaluation, or that you think there is a better disability category that describes your child's needs, or if you want there to be a change of placement, you want there to be some kind of change of their free appropriate public education, those would be times also that you're supposed to get a prior written notice, an actual form written, and we'll talk in a minute about what exactly goes into that form. So what's important is that when you're sitting in those IEP meetings, and you make different requests, like, well, I think we need to increase the amount of speech and language services my child gets. And if the school district says, no, we think the 30 minutes a week is appropriate, that would be something that triggers them writing you a prior written notice. And so what's helpful when you are in IEP or ARD meetings is to keep track of those things that you've requested and what the district decision is. And I've got a handy dandy handout about prior written notice. So I'm going to move my computer here. If you would like to get that handout, it's ready to go right today for you. And it goes through the information that we're talking about today. So just type in the 3 letters, PWN, in the comments, and my bot will answer you. You'll type in PWN one more time, and then the bot will give you the link for the handout. The other thing that you can get to is our show notes, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, so the handout I think would be real helpful, because some of this you want in writing that you can refer back to it. So like I said, that's why you really want somebody else with you at the IEP meeting, not just for emotional support, but keeping track of notes. So that can be a neighbor, that can be a friend, that can be an advocate. But as you go through the meeting, you really want to keep track of the things that you're requesting, or the things that the district is proposing to change. And all of that needs to be captured on that prior written notice. So let's look here. I want to make sure I'm not skipping anybody's questions. So we are going to continue on here. Now, this is the big question that always happens, right? It's like, well, when do I get this prior written notice. You are supposed to get it after a decision is made. So that always seems kind of weird. It's like, what? I thought it was prior. But the prior part comes into before the district implements any change. You need to get that notice. So when you're at the IEP meeting, a lot of times one of the last pages on the IEP form is a prior written notice form. And we'll talk about in a minute all the different things, the real specific things that are supposed to be in there. And sometimes you'll get the prior written notice after the IEP meeting has concluded within, a couple days. So one of the things that I wanted to see is how often or when do you guys get the prior written notices? Do you get it at the IEP meeting? Is that part of the form? Are you getting it after the meeting, or are you not getting it at all? So let us know in the comments when you usually get the prior written notice. And Lisa has a question. She says, so Charmaine, if you ask for like an assessment for your child, then the district needs to send a PWN. Yes, because you are making a request. And the district can't just ignore that and just or casually say, in a conversation, sorry, we don't think it's time really yet to do an evaluation. They have to send you a prior written notice for any type of evaluations, assessments. The exception would be that if they're doing like state or district assessments, they don't have to give you prior written notice for that. But if they're doing some kind of a special education assessment, or you're requesting it and they're either refusing to do it, or even if they agree, they still have to give you the prior written notice. And so Karen has a question. Karen says, is there a timeline for when you should expect the PWN after the IEP meeting? And no, in the federal regulations, there's no specific timeline, which is always a bug, right? Because it's like, what? How long should I have to wait? And that's why you want to check your state regs. Some state regulations will give specific timelines. So, Karen, let us know what state you're watching from, and I could go look up, if you want, your state regs and see what they say about that. So many things in the federal law talk about like a reasonable time period, but what does reasonable mean too? I mean, it's going to mean something different to everybody. I would say within 3 to 5 days after your IEP meeting, if you haven't received a prior written notice, that you want to send a letter for that. And I do have in the handout a sample letter that you can use for requesting the prior written notice. So if you want to get the sample letter today, just type in the letters PWN, and hopefully my bot is awake and working. Karen says she's in Colorado. So yeah, Karen, for sure I can get back with you and let you know. But I used to advocate in Colorado, and from what I recall, there aren't any specific timelines. Most of the time in Colorado, they will have the prior written notice form at the end of the IEP, and it's usually done right there at the meeting. But let me know, Karen, do you get it during the meeting time, or are you having to wait for it? The other issue with Colorado years ago, when when I first moved to Colorado, like decades ago, Colorado hardly ever gave prior written notice. It was like this missing link. It's like nobody knew they were supposed to do that. But they've changed that, and in years since, most districts are aware that they have to give prior written notice, but you might check with them and see. So yeah, those are great questions. So keep them coming, because this is when it's going to be helpful for you guys. So the rest of you, let us know if you, in fact, get the prior written notice at the IEP meeting, or if you're waiting and having to get it later. Now, what is supposed to be in the prior written notice? And the federal law has really specific things about what needs to be included. And we're going to look at those 7 specific things right here. So you're supposed to have a description of what the school is proposing or refusing to do. So like in Alyssa's example, Alyssa, if you request an evaluation and the district is proposing, yes, we agree, we'll do the evaluation, they still give you the prior written notice and they tell you, exactly what that evaluation, they describe it of how the evaluation is going to occur. You also have to have an explanation of why the school proposes or refuses this action. So if they refuse to do an assessment when you requested it, they have to tell you why they are refusing that. And this is like a huge thing because so many times we kind of walk away and it's like, I don't even know why they said no. I have no idea what they're basing that decision on. And the beauty of the prior written notice is they have to tell you why. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about why in the heck you want to make sure that you get this prior written notice. But the explanation of why is like super important, and it should be specific. It shouldn't just be generic language. And so the other things that have to be in there, let me go back here, is you have to have a description of, oops, I'm moving the slides around too fast here. You have to have a description of other options that the school considered and the reasons why those options were rejected. So again, what I like about the prior written notice is it kind of slows the conversation down. And it really makes the district have to reflect and think about the decisions that they're making because they know they're going to have to tell you, this is why we decided it. These are other options we discussed, like for placement. A lot of times if a parent is requesting a less restrictive environment and the district has said no, they have to be able to go through, well, we considered having them spend more time in general ed. We considered, maybe having an extra adult in the classroom when they go to general ed. They have to look at the different options. So it's not just like, no, we decided not to do that. They really have to think through the process. They have to put it in writing so you have a copy of that. Now, there are more things that they have to put in the prior written notice too. So let's look at that. They have to tell you what kinds of information they use to base their decision. So if you're asking for an evaluation, they can say, we looked at the records. We saw that he had his, evaluation last year. We looked at the performance in the classroom. At this time, we don't feel like a new evaluation is necessary. But they've got to tell you all the sources of information that they use to reach that decision. So again, it's like keeping them accountable, keeping them, kind of holding their feet to the fire, that they have to be really thorough about how they make decisions. Now, the other thing that has to be in your prior written notice is any other relevant factors that they considered when they made their decision. And that could be input from the general ed classroom. That could be, hopefully, right, input from the parent, since you're part of this decision-making process. But any other factors that they considered, they also need to put in the prior written notice. And then the last two things that they need to have is they need to tell you how you can get a copy of your procedural safeguards and an explanation of that. They also need to give you information on other sources for help and understanding IDEA and what your rights are. So a lot of times this information is just printed on the bottom of the prior written notice. So many times they'll put the Parent Training Information Center in your state, or they might put the Disability Rights Organization in your state that helps parents. They might sometimes they put in Rights Law as like a website that parents can go to, but they're supposed to help you be able to look for outside resources about understanding what your rights are. So let me pull up some more questions. Lissa's got a good question. She said, is there an appeal process if you don't agree with their decision? Yeah, and the appeal process for not agreeing to a decision that they made they put it in writing in the prior written notice, but you still don't agree with it, then you have to use your typical, kind of resolution process where you can ask for another IEP meeting. You can ask for a facilitated IEP meeting. You could request for a mediation, session. If you feel like their decision is really against what the federal law says, you can file a state complaint, or you could file for due process. So those typical steps that you can do for any time when you disagree with a school decision would be the same steps that you could take once you get that prior written notice and you're like, no, this is not cutting it. I don't agree with that at all. Oops. Let me go back here because Karen has a question. She says, our most recent IEP meeting was January 17th. Wow. And I've not received his IEP or prior written notice regarding request decisions. I'm working hard on keeping the district accountable. And that's super important. So good for you. You really have to be persistent. The other thing is to create that paper trail and make sure that any follow-up, conversations that you have, that you then write an email and say, today, I met with you, thank you for, carving out time from your busy day. We talked about the need for me to receive the final copy of the IEP, for me to receive the prior written notice. And as of this date, I still haven't. Please let me, you can request. I request that I receive this no later than 3 business days from this date of the email. And if you don't receive it, then, that's kind of one of those things where you go to the next step. So you might email first the special ed teacher and copy the principal. And if you don't hear anything back, if you don't get the copy of the documents, then you can go up a step and you email the special ed director. But yeah, there's no reason for them to be delaying it that long. I mean, that's a really long time. I would say within 3 to 5 business days, to me, would be a reasonable timeline for you to get those documents. And Karen, I don't know what district you're in, but that's one of the things, if that district kind of has a reputation for not sending things out to parents in a timely manner, and other parents kind of forget about it or don't really bring it up again, they get used to getting away with that kind of behavior. So a lot of times it does take you as the parent to almost be that IEP police and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? So thanks for asking these questions. I'm going to look and see if we have any other questions. So keep them coming, and I'll keep going through here so we can make sure that we answer them. So let's see here. And now we're going to keep going. One of the things that I wanted to know is when you get your prior written notices from the school district, sometimes we don't even really read them. It's like, this is just another piece of paper, another form. But I do want you to get into the habit of starting to read those with more of a critical eye. And just like we want the IEP to be specific, we really want the prior written notices to be detailed too. So if you think about it, during an IEP meeting, there's lots of conversation about lots of different things, right? If maybe one of the big things that you talked about was change of placement because you wanted a, less restrictive environment, that's probably only one of many things. So that's why your note taker is really important, or if you record the meeting, to go back and re-listen to that, because chances are there's several things. I mean, just when you do a review IEP, right, you update goals. Well, that's a change in your child's FAPE, or their free appropriate public education. So every time you make changes, every time you amend IEPs, those are things that should be captured in that prior written notice. If you change service time, that needs to be in the prior written notice. All of those little things that you talk about almost at every IEP meeting, it's a list of things that have to be in that prior written notice, not just one of the things that maybe was the big, discussion of the meeting. So yes, Karen says, IEP police. I know. And it's like, I want to get some badges that say IEP police on it. I think it would be fun. And Karen says, yes, thanks for taking the time. I will definitely end up being the IEP police. I know that's not a job that we wanted in our job description, but unfortunately that kind of falls to us, because otherwise we don't really see that accountability. So let me see. I think I saw a question here from Kimberly. So let's bring it up. She said, we submitted our parental education concerns to be copied and pasted in the IEP. Good. In writing. Do they need to respond in writing? They have given us a very hard time including our concerns in the past. And this is like one of those things that is like so frustrating, because it's like, I don't know why some districts feel like they have to argue or debate about what the parent concerns are. It's like, no, these are your concerns. It's not up for debate. They have a responsibility to write and put that in the IEP. So, Kimberly, and I can come back after the show and I can give you the specific federal regulation that talks about meaningful parent participation, and how parental concerns is a required component of the IEP. And I love, Kimberly, how you talked about wanting that to actually be copied and pasted into the actual IEP document. That is like a great advocate strategy, because what I see some parents do is they'll, email it or bring a copy of their parental concerns to the meeting, and the district will say, well, thank you, we'll attach this to the IEP. And one of the things I really suggest to parents is never have things attached to the IEP document, because they get lost conveniently sometimes and they never show up again. So there is a place in the IEP form, even if they're using a computerized form, where it says, or it should be saying, parental concerns. and there should not be any kind of refusal. So that would be one of the things that you could ask the district for a prior written notice on, Kimberly. So if you're giving your concerns, if you're requesting that they be written in the IEP and they're not doing it, then make sure you get the handout for today and the letter that you can send requesting a prior written notice. And you just have to keep being persistent. I mean, it's, what I say is like what we accept continues, right? So we've got to not accept this behavior of theirs that is totally inappropriate. So I'm glad that you're asking for it to be inserted in the document. But if they're, kind of stringing you along and not doing that, then I would send a formal letter. And then in the handout for the PWN, I have up here in the sample that you write to the special ed director. Sometimes it could be the principal, but to me, if it's gotten to a point where you haven't received it, then I just want to go right to the special ed director, and you could copy the principal, you could copy the teacher, but the director needs to know that that's not happening in the district. The director should know that that's a compliance issue, that they're not following through on those procedural safeguards, and that can be something that can be serious if it continues. So it's like so frustrating, but we just have to keep on them, or sometimes it doesn't really happen. So let me go back here. And so let us know. Do you get much information when you get the prior written notice? And then the other point is, how is it given? So we need to make sure that it's given in the native language of the parent or other mode of communication of the parent. And then there's a phrase like whenever feasible. So there are actually some languages that aren't written languages. So in that case, they would have to make the document as a verbal thing, and it needs to be in the parent's native language. So I was working with a family a few years ago, and their native language was Japanese. So, the district didn't have any forms made up in their native language, but then they were required to. So, they needed to be able to give that parent their procedural safeguard rights and give their prior written notice in Japanese. And so they wound up hiring a Japanese interpreter in the local community to help them do that. But, and like any parents that speak English as a second language, please know that you can always request an interpreter to be at your meetings. Even if you speak English, if you have learned it as a second language, a lot of times it's hard to think, and we know in IEP meetings, it's hard to think sometimes real clearly. And especially if you're having to constantly translate that in your head to a language that you learn better with. So please, if you're an advocate and work with other families, if you know friends that have English as their second language, know that they can request an interpreter, and the district should be providing that. So the other thing about how it's supposed to be is, this is kind of funny, it's supposed to be written in a language understandable by the general public. And it's like, so do any of the things that we talk about, would they make sense to the general public? Probably not, right? But it should be in parent-friendly language. It should be not a lot of mumbo jumbo, not a lot of acronyms. And so that's the other part of the federal regulation. And like I said, always check with your state regs, because you might even have more rights when it comes to what has to be in a prior written notice, or when you get it, your state might have a specific timeline. They might have more information besides the 7 points that the federal law says of what has to be in there. But basically, the decision, they can give you the prior written notice after the decision has been made, but before it's implemented. So that's the other trick with prior written notice, because how many times when you get a new draft IEP, they've already said, like, say, your IEP meeting is on February 8th, and they put in the service time, like the new services are going to start. Well, that's a Friday, so 9th and February 11th. But that doesn't give you any time to look at the prior written notice and really understand it before they implement it. So the common practice of them just saying the day after the IEP meeting is when everything is going to be implemented really goes against prior written notice, because it's supposed to give you notice before it's implemented. So the other thing that would be interesting when you request or when you've had a meeting, so like Karen was saying that she had a meeting January 17th, and my guess is, Karen, whatever changes were made on that meeting on January 17th have probably already been implemented. And if they didn't ever give you the prior written notice, that's a mistake on their part. So they need to be aware of this. And a lot of times parents are the ones that even know more about the law and what the rules are than special ed teachers. And please know, I'm not an attorney, so I can't give you legal advice. This is based on my knowledge and my training as an advocate. But for sure, we need to hold them accountable for doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? So we're going to kind of end with, why do you need the prior written notice? And because it's one of your basic procedural safeguards, and I don't have that showing here. And this is something that you don't want to take lightly. I mean, at the beginning of meetings, they probably always offer you, do you want another copy of your procedural safeguards? And most parents say, no, I already have a ton of those at home. But you always want to make sure that the rights that are listed in those procedural safeguards are really being enforced by the school district, and they're really offered to you. So prior written notice is one of those things. If you want to find more information about it, pull out one of those copies the district has given you in the past of your procedural safeguard rights and look at it, and look at the section that talks about prior written notice. And this is like another thing. It's like another thing I have to do, but it's really important, because if you don't understand your rights, then they get away with doing a lot of things that they do, which in the long run is what can cause your child frustration and not being as successful at school. Karen brings up another good question. She says, how are they able to do a prior written notice in an IEP meeting if they're going to write it thoughtfully? They can't know ahead of time what the conversation in the meeting will look like. And you're absolutely right. So what I've noticed here in Idaho is some districts do a much better job of that. They will have somebody taking the meeting notes, but they also sometimes will have a second person from the district that is keeping track of what those conversations were. And that's why, as a parent, you want to have a note taker, because you can't really be, involved in the back and forth conversation and capturing all the notes. But, one of the things that I've found useful is to use a legal pad, and you can, jot down notes on the line section, but then over in that margin, that's where I'll make a note, and I'll just put PW in. And so at the end of the meeting, we can come back and I can look through my notes and say, these are all the things that we need to have the PW in about. And, I think you bring up a good point. It's like how thoughtful and how much time do they really have to reflect if they're going to write it right there at the IEP meeting. If it's a really kind of big issue and there's been lots of back and forth, a lot of times they'll say, we will, email you the prior written notice by the end of the week. So depending on how many issues, depending on how much disagreement there is, you can get it at the end of the IEP meeting. And I think they can, fill it out and be thoughtful. But if there's some really big issues, it's probably better if they take the time and write that up and get that back to you in a couple days. But the thing is, right, if they're not going to give it to you right away, then they aren't supposed to implement any of those changes right away either. And I think that's the part that often gets forgotten by administrators, teachers, and parents. So I'm glad you're here getting this information. The other thing that you can do is share the video on your Facebook page so other parents get this information too, because the whole idea is that we want more parents to be empowered and know this information. So if you haven't had a chance, type PWN in the comments, and I will check after the show and make sure you're getting the link. You can also, there's a tab that you can click on if you want the show notes. And the show notes are good because each week I do the key takeaways of the show, and I give you the timestamp where you can go to that specific part in the video and hear that answer. And I give you quotes that are good to use and also other resources. So we'll be giving you other resources. One of the big resources is this handout that I put together for you for prior written notice. So this is really handy. It has the main points that we talked about, and you can always refer back to that. So let me see if we have any other questions. Today we've talked about when it must be given. And basically that's when the school district is proposing to make a change or they're refusing to make a change. And it has to be prior to when they implement something. We talked about what? There's 7 basic things that have to be in that prior written notice. It has to be in the native language of the parent and in language that the general public could understand. And the reason why you want to make sure you get the prior written notice is because it's one of your basic procedural rights, and you need to make sure that you enforce those rights. So thank you for being here. I'm going to check and see if we have any other comments or questions. So Karen has a comment. She says, yes, the district needs to copy, paste, attach versus paraphrase. Yeah, and I would even say scratch out attach. I don't like things attached. But yeah, I mean, it's like, this is your input. It's just like the, evaluation report from the school psychologist. If there's inaccuracies in the report, you want to make sure that gets corrected. But we're not like nitpicking at how the school psychologist wrote their report necessarily. And they can't be nitpicking about what your concerns are because they're your concerns. They might not agree with it, but that doesn't matter because that's still something that you're concerned about. And the other part about parent concerns is, to me, that word concerns, I kind of think as a negative, like these are the issues that you want corrected. But also for parent concerns, I look at it as parent input, and you want to talk about your child's strengths in each of the academic areas. You want to talk about your child's present level of performance from what you see. So all of those things in the IEP are things that you want to make sure you have input on. And I'm going to be doing a challenge coming up in the spring, and we're going to be talking about going on an IEP scavenger hunt. So you might want to stay tuned to hear more about that, because that's a fun challenge that we do, and you actually go through and look for things that should be in the IEP that may be missing. Let's see. So Karen says, we'll share. Thank you. Got the link in Messenger. Oh, good. So I always wonder if my bot is awake and working. Lisa says, thanks. And she says, I always take the copy of the procedural safeguard rights. And I don't know. I guess, sometimes I think that's really good too, because you never know if the state or somebody has made some changes in that language. And so you do really need an updated copy of it. If nothing else, if it's exactly like what you got the year before, you can cut it up and make scratch paper with it. But the other thing that I always think would be interesting is if you actually sat down with a special ed teacher or an administrator and had them talk through that procedural safeguard document, because what I find is a lot of teachers don't understand it. Now, I don't necessarily want you to take time during the IEP meeting, because then you won't get to the IEP, but you can always schedule a meeting with the teacher, the director, and say, let's go through this document, because it is mumbo jumbo and it can be really hard to understand. So know that you can do that too. So Karen says, thanks again for taking the time to help us better understand how to best advocate for our kiddos. And Karen, I'm glad you were here today and that you found this helpful. Next week is Valentine's Day, and we're going to try something different. We will have a show at noon Mountain Time next Thursday, and we're going to try something different. We're going to try a Facebook watch party. So has anybody done that yet? This is going to be the first time, so I'm like crossing my fingers that we won't have any tech problems. So I will be posting things in my Visions and Voices Together Facebook page about that. So keep your eye peeled over there. But that will be happening on the 14th. Next Thursday will be our first Facebook watch party. And we'll be watching a video together and commenting. And it should be a fun kind of activity. So I thought we would change it up for Valentine's Day. But I thank you so much for being here. I am so excited that more and more parents are learning information, asking questions, writing emails, and holding the district accountable, because in the end, we want your child to be safe, happy, and learning every day with their friends at school. So until next Thursday, I am Charmaine Tanner. Take care, and we shall see you soon. Bye-bye. And make sure you share the video, right? And